Nora Fuller, who goes by Nora, disappeared from her home January 11, 1902, in San Francisco. She was only 15 years old. It would be a few weeks before her deceased body was found upstairs in a fairly empty house at 2211 Sutter Street on February 8th, nearly a month after she had disappeared. She was found unclothed on a bed in a room mostly unfurnished, except for the bed and a chair. Her clothing was one of the things that helped identify her. It was what she had been wearing when she was last seen. Of course, so early on, it's all conjecture, but given the state of the body and the disorder of the room, it was considered murder, not suicide, almost immediately. When Nora was last seen, she was leaving to go meet a John Bennett, who had put out an ad for someone to help take care of a child. She was going to meet him at the popular restaurant to discuss the ad. Her mother, Mrs. Alice Maud Mary Fuller, who I'll refer to as Nora's Ma, was divorced, and Nora was seeking employment to help the family out. The ad that she answered was, "Wanted, a young white girl to take charge of a child and do light housekeeping. Apply Box 1220. After she answered the ad, she received a reply that says, quote, "If this letter does not reach you in time, call at the popular restaurant, 55 Geary Street, at 1 o'clock. Call at 6 p.m. Ask the restaurant for John Bennett. Signed, John Bennett." End quote. This note is worded odd, but it means if she couldn't make 1 o'clock, come at 6 o'clock. She left her home at 5 p.m. An hour later, she phoned her brother, Lewis, that she was at the 1500 block of Geary Street. He asked her something, and she responded that she was with Bennett at his residence, and that was the 1500 Geary Street address. She said that Mr. Bennett and his family were nice people and wanted her to work right away. Lewis asked her to hold and conveyed the message to their mother, who said for Lewis to tell Nora to come home straight away and bring food for Sunday at the market. Nora had money on her for this very purpose. Lewis would say that though Nora sounded cheerful, Lewis felt that there was something nervous about her voice. He had left home to go to a meeting, and when he returned home around 11 p.m., he found his mother freaking out, understandably, as Nora had still not returned home. He ran to the popular restaurant and found it closed. He went to 1500 Geary Street, the address where Bennett supposedly lived, and found it to be a vacant lot. The following day, Nora's absence was reported to the police. No-brainer where we should start. Who is John Bennett? And the person whose name this house was under, the house where Nora's body was found, C.B. Hawkins. Who is that? Already, this early on, it's assumed that Bennett and Hawkins are, in fact, the same person. Hawkins was described as a man of middle age, medium height, on the larger side, with a reddish complexion and blonde or ginger mustache. Bennett, pretty much the same description. Hawkins, the one who had applied for the house to be a renter, said at the time that he wanted an unfurnished home for himself and a wife, that he had no children. After viewing the house, he'd said he would take it, and at this point was currently staying at the Golden West Hotel. But other than inquiring one time for any mail left for him, he was not actually staying there. Suspicions began to arise. Hawkins had not apparently moved into the house yet and had only paid for 1 month's rent, and that month was up. The house owner sent a clerk, whose name was Dean, to go prepare the house for another tenant. And that's when the clerk made the horrific discovery of Nora's murdered body. Though some strewn about mail had been found, there was nothing to give any kind of clue as to who the real C.B. Hawkins was. When the clerk discovered the body, he ran out into the street and found policeman Gill, who went back with him to the house to see if an investigation was warranted. Indeed, it was warranted. On her body were no apparent marks of violence. There were 2 marks on the throat, but they weren't sure on the initial investigation if that was from advanced decomposition or violence. Autopsy was performed by Dr. Louis Basigalupi, but that didn't help matters much. Vital organs in good condition. Again, no strong evidence of violence. Gas asphyxiation was a possibility, but the detectives and police negated that as there were no signs in the house of a gas leakage. Stomach didn't yield any kind of poisonous material. Owner of the house, E.C. Pryber, who uses an agency to help him rent it out, said, quote, "I bought the house at 2211 Sutter Street 6 months ago. Up to the first of last month, it was occupied by Mr. Lowenthal, the cloak man. My agents informed me that a man named Hawkins desired to take the house, and they found that he was all right after looking up his references. He took the house about the 8th or 9th. I was informed that he had not moved in any furniture, and I became a little bit dubious. I ascertained that one of Hawkins's references was Mr. Weinecke of the Golden West Hotel. I called on that gentleman, and we examined the register. All we could find was the name C.W. Harkins. In other places, it's C.B. Hawkins. I was then informed that Mr. Harkins had stayed at the hotel a day and that they knew nothing of him. I reported the result of my investigations to Umsen and Company, the agency, and I suppose that they investigated on their own account. At any rate, they sent a man out there and he rang the bell or did something else like that, and not finding anyone home, came back and reported this fact to his employers. I only had one key to the house, and this was turned over to the tenant when he paid his first month's rent. I never went near the house. I simply made any complaint to the agents." End quote. C.S. Lehanier of the Upson and Company, who are the agency overseeing the building, said this, quote, "He took the key and subsequently signed the contract and paid the first month's rent, $30. He said his name was C.B. Hawkins and he wished to take possession of the house on the next day, the 9th. Indeed, he was peremptory in his desire and determination to go in the day following. On signing the lease, he demanded also that the rubbish should be removed from the premises, and said that if it was not, he would decline to go into the place. We had it removed, and all was right up to that time. I could not say whether a woman was with Hawkins when he came to the offices. So many people come in that I cannot remember them, unless they actually do business with me." Hawkins was evidently an American. By that I mean he was not a foreigner. He was a man about 35 or 40 years of age, had a light brownish mustache, and was well built. He looked to me to be a businessman and was well dressed. End quote. Several people were brought in to identify Nora, which is just odd to me that the police or whomever needed so many people. Anyway, at one point, her brother Louis was brought in. Because of decomposition, he wasn't sure about her face, etc., but on seeing a vaccination mark on her left calf, he said it was her, and when asked about the clothing, he said that they were hers. Additionally, the family attorney, Hugh Grant, was brought in to ID the body. This is weird. Is that normal? And then in the next day's paper, it was talking about, quote, "A constant stream of people of nearly every station in life visited the morgue and looked with horror on the remains of the unfortunate Nora Fuller," end quote. That's absolutely horrible, to my mind anyway. I have no qualms about my own demise and what happens, but to others, have some respect and dignity for the dead. An elderly woman came in and asked one of the deputies to see the body. "Did you know her?" she was asked. "Well, no, I did not, but I would like to see the remains," end quote. And yeah, she was allowed to. And then she was escorted out as she began to cry at the sight of the poor girl. You know, going to a theater is a better way to spend your day, though perhaps not as cheap. Nora's ma would say, quote, "I am sure that she was cruelly murdered in her attempt to secure her freedom and come home to us. I do hope that the police will search the house where she was murdered from top to bottom. I think that she might have taken a pen and scratched a farewell message on the wall. She might have concealed a note somewhere in her clothes. Please ask the police to make a diligent search of the house and of her garments," end quote. Neighbors near the home where Nora was murdered claimed not to have seen anything suspicious, nor anyone really, except one thought they saw Hawkins entering and leaving the house at least once, but couldn't remember how many times or on what dates. For the most part, they never saw any lights on, never saw anyone go in or out. So Dr. Basigalupi did a little more look-see at Nora, and he had removed some of the skin from the area of her throat. What on the surface was just light bruising, below the surface he found 2 bruises about the size of a $50. The bruises were made by someone's fingers, specifically the thumb and forefinger to the Adam's apple, choking her to death. The meager furniture in the house looked to be secondhand, the bedding not dirty but not recently cleaned. A flask with only a few remaining drops of brandy was found on the floor. Unlit candles, 2, were found in the bedroom closet. Nora's clothing was on a chair near the bed. Circulars were found on the floor addressed to C.B. Hawkins, and even to a Mrs. C.B. Hawkins. However, we will remember that Hawkins had rented the apartment for himself and his alleged wife. But people are speculating that perhaps Nora thought she was to become his wife, that perhaps those circulars were meant for her to establish their home. Now, we know a little bit about the Hawkins fellow who rented the apartment. John Bennett, thought to be the same person most likely, but what is known about him? As we know, Bennett met Nora at a restaurant called the Popular Restaurant, owned and operated by F.W. Crone Jr. Crone, when asked about Bennett, said that Bennett had a bad reputation, but in what way in particular, it was not said. He had been a proprietor of the restaurant for some 15 years. Apparently, Bennett wore clerical-type clothing, as he alleged that he had studied for the ministry some 8 years ago. Apparently, wanting to keep up that pretense and perhaps seeming to be innocent on the surface. Crone would say, quote, "Last Saturday evening, Mr. Bennett, when he entered for dinner, left instructions with me that should a young girl call for him, I should bring her at once to his table, which was in the center of the dining room. At about 6 o'clock, he left the restaurant, and I noticed him walking up and down the sidewalk for some time, but do not remember having seen him meet anyone. He has not been in my restaurant since." End quote. Thorough searches of the house Nora's body was found in have commenced, and nothing unusual. The toilet was searched and ripped, just in case some scrap of paper found its way inside. Flues and chimney were searched for paper remnants. The washstand showed no sign of being used in recent time. So though points are leading to this Bennett Hawkins, we still got to look at all possibilities. Nora's mother, who has become ill with the murder of her daughter, is being asked about other men in the family's life. Regarding Count Serebrnik at the Palace Hotel, Nora's mother would say, quote, "I met Serebrnik last May. He came from China bearing a letter from my brother whose name is Cooper. My brother and Serebrnik are both employed by the same mercantile house. The Count went to Russia and returned in January. He arrived, I believed, on a Wednesday, and the Friday following I called on him at the Palace Hotel, accompanied by my daughter Nora. He sailed on the City of Peking at 1 p.m. January 11th for China. That was the day my daughter disappeared. My son, Louis J. Parlane, went down to the wharf and saw the Count depart." End quote. Regarding family attorney Hugh C. Grant, Nora's ma would say, quote, "I was having considerable legal work done in connection with my divorce, and the attorneys I was employing did not give me satisfaction. I casually noticed an advertisement in some paper of Attorney Grant, and I was impressed with the name, as I once had a dear friend by that name. I called on him and he attended to my legal work. During the months of July and August, I boarded his 11-year-old daughter, Ethel, at her father's request. Grant never paid me in full for the board of the child and was in debt to me for this arrangement. I can thus easily explain Nora's going into his office and borrowing car fare from him. Grant used to come out to the house, but I am not aware that he ever went out with Nora. Grant and Count Serebrnik never met and were not acquainted. The paper said today that Nora was 16. This is a mistake. She was only 15 and a half. She looked more like 14 than her real age. She was a very studious girl, and the only time that she went downtown was to exchange books at the Free Public Library." End quote. Nora's mom was asked, "Did your daughter ever work at any time?" She responded, quote, "Yes, she worked during the months of October and November of last year for a family at a private hotel, taking care of children. When she answered the advertisement just before she disappeared, she and I decided that she should come home and sleep every night." End quote. So why the Serebrnik inquiry? It was thought that Hawkins' signature resembled that of the Count. His card was also in Nora's purse. Just to let you know now, Count Serebrnik, so-called lead, never went anywhere. And why the Attorney Grant inquiry? Because he was well acquainted with her, had even bought her the dress that she had been last seen wearing. He does state, because to some this would sound suspicious, that he did that because his daughter Ethel was staying with the Fullers and he had noticed that Nora was not well dressed, so he gave the money for the dress purchase also to help pay off the debt he owed to Nora's ma for his daughter staying with the Fullers. February 11th, 1902. Well, apparently we not only have Bennett Hawkins, we also have this same man going by the name of Scott who purchased bedding at a store called Kavanaugh's. Beyond that, still don't know. Attorney Grant will be heavily looked into. This is what he would say after claiming not to have ever known this Bennett feller. Quote, "If there is such a man in existence, I don't know him. It is true that I am well acquainted with Mrs. Fuller and her family. I knew Eleanor. I first met her several years ago. I was on friendly terms with her and her mother. My object in presenting her with a dress there has been so much talk about was to show my appreciation of hers and her mother's friendship. The reason I was not positive about her identification on the night that I saw her body in the morgue was because I had determined to make sure that the remains were those of Eleanor before informing her mother. So far as I know, she had very few male acquaintances. I think if she had a sweetheart, she would have told me on account of the confidence she reposed in me. As I was acting as the legal advisor of Mrs. Fuller, she frequently sent the girl to my office on business errands. It was not unusual for me to hand her car fare whenever she came to my office. I don't know that I ever met Miss Graham. In fact, I am pretty sure that I did not. I am satisfied that if she was in the habit of meeting this man Bennett, she would have told me. I knew nothing about her trying to procure a situation." End quote. This Miss Graham was supposedly a friend of Nora's, but whatever was going on with her didn't pan out. Miss Graham would claim that Nora was meeting a young man on the reg, and we'll talk briefly about that later. So we're back to Mr. Crone of the popular restaurant with a description of this Mr. Bennett. What peculiarity was there about Bennett? He had a decided cast in his right eye. Did the eyelid droop? It did, slightly. Did his hands indicate that he was used to manual labor? His hands were always in good condition. By that I mean that he was not used to hard work, and I should say had never done any arduous labor. What height was he, Mr. Crone? About 5 feet 7 inches. Stout? He weighed about 160 pounds. In what condition were his teeth? He had excellent teeth. Prominent at all? Slightly so. Was his mustache gray? No, not at all. It was a brownish color. His chin? Rather long chin. His face, too, was long. Anything characteristic about his walk? Yes, he had something of a military walk. He took long strides. Did he appear to you to be a business or a professional man? He appeared to me to be a man belonging to some profession. Did he show by any act in the years that he had visited your place an inclination to be studious? It always occurred to me that he was a studious man. He was always reading, if not the papers, some book he invariably carried with him. Anything peculiar about his clothes? No, but he was always well dressed. February 12, 1902. Coroner's jury has been called. Their names and addresses were published in the paper, and they were escorted to the house where Nora's body was found, and also to view Nora's body and to the police department to inspect her clothing and other items found in the house. Still under suspicion is Grant, who was obviously not at the restaurant when Bennett was supposed to meet Nora, but the police, grappling onto the tiniest of leads, took him around to various places of business that Bennett was alleged to have gone to have them say if Grant is Bennett. No, he isn't. According to the restaurant, according to the clothing and bed furniture dealers, no one who clapped eyes on Bennett have said that he is Grant. It was mentioned before that Nora's mother wanted the walls of the murder house to be inspected. It was because Nora routinely would write random thoughts upon her walls, particularly in corners. If Nora had ever been in a house alive, Nora's mother expected that there would maybe be a message of some sort. But none, at least none that would be helpful at all, were found, even when Mrs. Fuller was taken there herself to look. Quote, I know that my daughter would not go into an empty house alone with a strange man. She was too timid. She would have stopped at the door, and no inducement would have made her go up to that dark stairway. She was too timid and would have scented danger at once. She might have been drugged and carried upstairs, but I think someone would have seen her going in. I am sure she never went in there alive. Then again, and I think it will be found to be true, she was killed somewhere else, and her body carried there in the darkness of night. In a sack, maybe. I can think of no way else that she would have gone into that house. End quote. Attorney Grant's stenographer, Miss Potter, was questioned about the relationship between Attorney Grant and Nora. Quote, Nora Fuller came quite often, but Mr. Grant seldom talked to her in private. It was nearly always in my presence, too, that he spoke to her. He addressed her as a fond father would address his child, the conversation being on ordinary social matters. I cannot say how she became possessed of the Rader and Schneider card. Her coming to the office I always attributed to the legal business with which her mother was concerned. Mr. Grant always behaved in a most gentlemanly and courteous manner towards me, and my reason for leaving him was with the object of bettering my position. I left his employ January 21st last." End quote. So the deal with the Radar and Schneider business card was that it was found in Nora's things. Miss Potter's statement was the police asking if Attorney Grant's office had any of those cards where Nora would have gotten a hold of one. That's a no. She also denied ever hearing or seeing a man by the name of Bennett in the office. February 13th, 1902. Nora's body, seen by just about everyone in San Francisco, is finally laid to rest privately with only family and friends in attendance. Outside the church, though, were some 2,000 or so people who, at least this newspaper said, were not the morbidly curious, but wanting to be a comfort to the family. Her funeral would end up being rather full of advice by the Reverend Bain. From the San Francisco Call, February 14th, 1902. Nora Fuller had died for others that others might be saved such a death as came to her. The lessons drawn were not in connection with her home relations, but regarding men, could they be called men, who preyed upon virtue and womanly honor. Fiends who, by the aid of an advertisement, got the guileless, the innocent, in their lecherous clutches. He declared, they're talking about Bain, that conditions would not be well in the future for such fiends in the community. End quote. Reverend Bain would say, quote, "There are men and women who spend a lifetime in prosecuting the downfall of young girls. They must be brought to time. In this city and throughout the land, there is a traffic, and men for so much a head procure innocent girls. People of California will demand legislation in future to meet the crime." End quote. Continues the newspaper, quote, "Bain warned girls against temptations and snares and showed the necessity for the chaperone. He said that in their modesty and their quietness was their defense, and prayed for their own sakes neither by look nor word would they respond to attentions given them on the streets by men, by strangers, by lecherous men. The defense of honor lies in the homes and not in the lodging houses. In the homes of sunshine is to be found the defense of our morals. There are so many men, shame to say, so brutal and fiendish that it seems that every girl is born into peril. He besought fathers and mothers to keep close to their daughters and lead such a life that the daughters will cling to them." End quote. February 16, 1902. Though this story is in the newspaper every day, there isn't much new to say. Apparently there was a bloodstained towel on the body, but that wasn't a towel Nora would have brought with her or from her home. It also appeared to have been laundered several times, and unfortunately it's not said if the blood was fresh or if the blood was already in the towel and had been washed. Where did the blood come from? Though, yes, Nora was found nude, there was no mention anywhere, discreetly or not, that Nora had been assaulted in that manner, and that she had died from being choked to death. And then still curious as to Nora calling her brother to let him know where she was. But where she was, where she said she was a vacant lot and not a house. Did she purposely lie, or did she mess up over the street number or street name? February 19th. Now, this is interesting to me, but they are conducting a public investigation of this case, and it feels like a court trial, except they don't have a defendant. Nora's mother is testifying, that's what it appears to be anyway, about the events of that day leading up to what is the last conversation her family had with Nora, which was when Nora had called that she would be a nurse to a child for a family, getting $20 a month on 1500 Geary Street, and that when her son Louis, who had taken the call, had told her the message while still on the phone with Nora, that she wanted Nora to go to the store on her way home, and it was understood by Nora's ma that Nora had received that message, and that she had told Louis she would go to the market. Also, Nora's ma spilled tea that Nora was not fond of Attorney Grant. The attorney, whose name had been bandied about as a suspect, but there were no grounds for that, would sometimes show up at their house drunk, which isn't great. Stories that Nora had gone to the camp of troops at the Presidio and would go to bars in the area of Camp Merritt were without foundation, at least according to her mother. Regarding that bloodstained towel, Nora's mom said it could have come from the house, but wasn't completely sure. Louis Parlane, her brother, testified regarding his return home on the evening of the disappearance and being told by the mother that Nora had gone to a sort of job interview. Quote, "Between 6:15 and 6:30 o'clock of that evening, I was called up by telephone and my sister conversed with me. I am positive it was my sister who spoke to me over the phone. She said that she was in the 1500 block of Geary Street, that she was with Mr. Bennett's family and had a nice position. She said that the family wanted her to go to work at once and requested me to speak to my mother about it. I went to my mother's room and told her what Nora said. My mother wanted Nora to come home at once, and I went back to the telephone to tell my sister so. Nora seemed to hesitate in answering me and seemed as if she was frightened. Then she said that she was at 1500 Geary Street and that she would come home as mother requested. Then the phone was hung up and the conversation between us was shut off." End quote. Other business and trade men would testify about the man supposedly Bennett. Madge Graham, Nora's friend I mentioned earlier, would testify, quote, "Nora asked me not to listen when she telephoned Bennett. I asked her who Bennett was, and Nora said he was a friend of hers." End quote. Nora would apparently make these phone calls from a nearby grocery store. With all the questioning, nothing new was brought to light that wasn't already known, and I guess there weren't anyone's stories that had changed. March 1st, 1902. It's been a little gap in news until March 1st when a suspect has been captured. I am not going to bother telling you this story because it went nowhere. By the next day after the arrest, even the newspaper is saying the captain of detectives is pathetic at trying to pin the murder on this man, that it was only done, quote, with the sole object of attracting public attention of the vigilance of Captain Seymour, end quote. It was also called a fiasco and that, quote, Seymour's bubble connecting blank with the murder of Nora Fuller has exploded with a loud report, the echoes of which will not soon die away, end quote. Ouch. April 9th, 1902. So apparently we have a new person in this case who can perhaps shed some more light on this relationship between Nora and Bennett/Hawkins. Now, we already know what Miss Graham said. This is from a Miss Baker. She's now married, but I'll just call her Miss Baker, who allegedly is a friend of Nora's who the police have been trying to track down, and they finally found her in Arizona. She would say she was employed at the Olympia, which apparently is a kind of resort. Like Miss Graham, Miss Baker would say she had been acquainted with Bennett for months, like 4 months prior to Nora's death. Nora told Miss Baker that the unnamed man, who everyone believes is Bennett, was her dearest friend, and Miss Baker was introduced to him one night in August, but she didn't remember what his name was. His appearance is very like that of Bennett. Miss Baker was not overly impressed with the alleged Bennett's appearance or manners. There was a gap of time when Miss Baker left the city for a month or two, but on her return, she again saw Nora with the same guy on some street. She went up to Nora to shake hands, and the guy greeted her coldly and took Nora away down the street. Miss Baker would say, quote, I have tried to avoid this unpleasant subject for the reason that I have no desire to rake up my career as a performer. I first met Nora Fuller around the Olympia, and she seemed to be quite a clever little girl. Since her body was found in the house on Sutter Street, I have tried in vain to remember the name she called her companion when she first introduced him to me. I am satisfied that he is the man who strangled her. There was a peculiar drift to his actions about the girl, which gave me a distinct impression that he meant her harm. I am also satisfied that finally, after months of persuasion, he induced her to leave her home under the promise that he would install her in a handsomely furnished flat. The night I first met them in the Olympia, she several times asked him to tell her the time. She said she did not want to miss her last car, as her mother would be worried if she did not get home. She was so anxious to get home that I judged that when she halted in front of the restaurant on Taylor Street later, she began to pout about going in on account of the lateness of the hour. I know many people in San Francisco, and I am satisfied that the man was not a permanent resident of the city. I never saw him before, and his general appearance was peculiar. He did not look like a city man. He looked more to me like a street faker or a sharp country broker. I would give anything to recall his name, but it may come up to me someday. He seemed uncomfortable when in my company, and for that reason I never sought to learn anything about him. Particularly after I warned Miss Fuller against him, and she insisted so pointedly that he was all right. I would know him among 1,000 men. He had a peculiar face which I think would impress most women and few men. Judging from what I saw of him, he was fond of living around cheap places in the Tenderloin, for he seemed to know the resorts very well. Sheriff James Johnson and City Marshal James Kennedy of this county came to see me a few days ago. But I was taken suddenly ill and could not make a statement. I have promised to tell them tomorrow what I have stated for the call. the newspaper today, end quote. April 20th, 1902. We have ourselves a new suspect. Charles B. Hadley, advertising manager at a San Francisco newspaper. Newspaper asked police to look into the disappearance of Hadley when funds were missing, and so was he, on January 16, 1902. They found him living at number 647 Ellis with a lady. She claimed not to have known where he had gone. Now, at this point, he's not a suspect with Nora. In fact, people seem to not be looking too hard for him except the lady he was living with. Every clue she could find, she would present to the police. So how did he get linked to Nora? When he disappeared, a detective went on the case and worked with Ollie, his lady gal, to get some information. He saw Ollie on a streetcar some days ago and asked her if she had any new news. And she would say no, but that she was scared when she heard about Nora and decided to drop her own case into his disappearance. The detective wouldn't press her for more details, but would recount this conversation to head detective, who, of course, would grasp onto this potential new lead with gusto. So let's look at some things. Hadley disappeared on January 16th, when Nora's disappearance was first made public. He would leave all of his belongings and money in the bank. In their domicile was a photo of him with his handwriting. It was believed by handwriting experts to be the same writing as that on the mattress and bed clothing, plus the handwriting on the accounts at the newspaper office. The card which Bennett had written the note to Nora to meet him at the restaurant? Oh, guess what? Of course, it's missing. The only other handwriting sample of Bennett. Now, descriptions of Bennett, Hawkins versus Hadley did not quite match up, but Hadley was still viewed to be the murderer and the same person as Bennett Hawkins. So they bring in Hadley's lady friend, whose name was Ollie, again, to speak to the coroner's jury. Apparently, Hadley would wear a fake mustache around the house, pretending it was in good fun. Ollie would claim not to know if he would wear it out and about. Ollie said that Hadley would rouse early and read the news, particularly interested in the story of Nora. One morning, he became quite disturbed by one particular newspaper account, would stick the newspaper in his pocket and quickly leave the house. And Ollie never saw him again after that. She searched the house for some sort of clue and would find some of his clothing with red stains. It frightened her and she burned them. Of course, we know that Nora's death did not have any blood involvement as she was choked to death, as far as we know. Ollie was asked by the coroner if Hadley had peculiar habits. She would first state he didn't, but when pressed, she would say, quote, "Yes, I guess you could say he was a little eccentric about his eating," end quote. "In what way?" asked the coroner. "Why, he never ate much meat. When he did eat meat, he always ordered just the tenderloin part of a steak and had it well done," end quote. So then a waiter from the popular restaurant frequented by Bennett was called to testify, and he would say that Bennett always asked for the tenderloin part of the steak and had it cooked almost dry. Very circumstantial evidence, of course, but it got people excited. So the police artist took a picture of Hadley and drew a mustache and top hat on his head. The boy who delivered the bedding, the clerk who sold the bedding, the real estate agent who rented the house, man who sold the furniture, all identified the picture as Hawkins/Bennett. Well, there you go. No, kids, back up your truck. What about the popular restaurant personnel who saw Bennett more than anyone? They saw no resemblance to Bennett/Hawkins. Well, crap. Captain Seymour, quote, "I do not accuse Hadley of murdering Nora Fuller. It is not my custom to say in advance whether or not I believe a man guilty. But I do think that the facts we have developed tend strongly to connect Hadley with this crime and justify us in using our utmost efforts to effect his capture," end quote. Ollie's official statement to police, for the most part. Quote, "C.B. Hadley lived with me for 6 months in a flat on 647 Ellis Street. He rented the flat. Hadley disappeared on January 16, 1902. I believe he was last seen at the Lotta Fountain at about 6 o'clock that evening. He telephoned to me at about 5:30 o'clock that evening and told me that he would be home to dinner instead of our taking dinner downtown, as we intended to do, as it was my birthday. I have not seen him since the morning of January 16, 1902, and I have not heard from him since he telephoned me on the evening of that day. I saw him on the morning of that day, and he was all excited. When he went away, he threw some money to me and told me to put it in the bank for my birthday. During the preceding week, he bought me a pair of earrings and this gold chain I am wearing. On the day following his disappearance, I was making up his and my laundry, and at the very bottom of the pile of soiled clothes, I found one of his overshirts, one of his undershirts, and a pair of his drawers. There was blood on each of these 3 articles. There was more on the shirts than on the drawers. I took these bloody articles and burned them. On the morning that he disappeared, he did not change his clothes, something that he had never before failed to do. He always changed his clothes every morning. When I found the bloody garments, they were in the closet at the very bottom of the pile of soiled clothing. After Hadley disappeared, I gave some of his clothing to my brother-in-law's brother, a cutaway coat, a full dress suit, and an extra pair of pants. Another pair of his pants I made over for my brother. I burnt his plug hat and 2 of his other hats. I burnt the things because I was sick of looking at them. I was frightened. Yes, I was frightened about the Nora Fuller murder case. I did not want to get mixed up in anything. Yes, I suspected that Hadley has something to do with Nora Fuller's death. I mentioned it to a couple of my friends, saying, wouldn't it be funny if Hadley has something to do with Nora Fuller's murder? My friends ridiculed it and said that a man of Hadley's standing wouldn't have anything to do with such a thing. Hadley was 40 or more years of age. When we were living at 315 Ellis Street, Hadley's rooms were downstairs and mine were upstairs. Before we left there, I went down to his rooms one evening with another woman, and I found a little girl sitting there. I asked her if she hadn't made a mistake, and she said, no, isn't this Hadley's room? She said that Hadley had promised to meet her there at 9 o'clock, and I told her that he would not be home until 11 o'clock. The other woman and I went into the next room and were joking about the girl being there, and she got up and left. Hadley had liberty to do as he pleased while we were at 315 Ellis Street. Hadley could leave the examiner office whenever he wanted to. I think his right name is Start. His father had been dead for years, but his mother is living in Chicago. A little while before Hadley disappeared, we had a little quarrel, and he grabbed his mother's and father's pictures off the mantel and tore them up. The pictures had no connection with our quarrel. After Hadley disappeared, I telegraphed Mrs. John Start, or Hadley, and finally I got word from the telegraph company that Mrs. Start had received the telegram. I also wrote to her and received a reply that she knew no more about Hadley's whereabouts than I did. Hadley worked for the Examiner for 15 years. Sometimes he was drunk a week at a time. I understood that he was head bookkeeper and that he received a salary of $100 a week. Hadley was an American as far as I know. He used good grammar. He always had plenty of money. On the morning that Hadley disappeared, he got up very early and went down and got the paper. He carried the paper to the bathroom, where I afterward found it. It was not his custom to get up early and get the paper. He never did it before. Hadley always carried a newspaper in his pocket. He never read while we were eating at restaurants, so I am so nervous. He used to read at the table at home." End quote. Not in her official statement to the police, but to the newspapers. Quote, "No, I was not Hadley's mistress. He loved me, but I did not have any affection for him. He frequently went on his knees and begged me to marry him, but I declined his proposals. He was very lavish with his money. He earned a big salary and spent it freely. He did not like sporting women and would not talk to them. He was a peculiar fellow in many ways. He very seldom went around. He was devoutly attached to me, but I did not care for him. I have a friend in the East whom I love. I liked Hadley for the presents he gave me. Whether he is guilty or not, he will never return to this city." Hadley was not his real name. His name is Start, and his mother lives in Chicago. Personally, I don't care for the notoriety, but I am sorry for my people. They are too nice to be brought into this case." End quote. Again, Crone of the popular restaurant was intensely emphatic that Hadley was not Bennett. Crone actually had known Hadley for 8 years and said that there was no way Hadley could have disguised himself that well, because Crone also knew Bennett. But as we know, others would differ, though these were people who knew neither Hadley nor Bennett all that well. April 22, 1902. A famed handwriting expert of the time, Theodore Keitka, would tell the police that the man who wrote the advertisement that Nora answered, the man who signed the contract with the real estate company for the murder house, was Charles Hadley. Miss Baker would say that Hadley and the man she saw with Nora resembled each other. Mr. Keitka would write in a letter, "San Francisco, April 20th. George Whitman, Chief of Police. Dear Sir, Owing to a misstatement regarding me in today's Examiner, I hereby give you a report of my connection with the Examiner pencil advertisement. On March 22, 1902, Captain Seymour gave me the Examiner pencil ad in the Nora Fuller murder case, with the instruction to make a photograph of same, and not to use it for any examination of handwriting under any circumstances, as the Examiner had pledged Captain Seymour not to divulge the fact of the existence of this ad in the Examiner office. Therefore, I made no use of the handwriting on the Examiner blank until recently. While photographing same, however slightly enlarged, I was impressed by the appearance of the first word, white, and the caret below the body of the advertisement. Both this word and mark were written with the same quality of pencil as were the figures 31, 1, 40, 3, 2080, and the word examiner, which figures and word are written by a different hand from the word white, and the remainder of the ad. In order to obtain a specimen of pencil used in Examiner business offices, I inserted an advertisement and obtained a card marked Box 5383. I asked the young man behind the counter to allow me to see the pencil he used. It was marked 314 Eagle Drafting. Not wishing to break up my collection of pencils, I obtained a pencil from Mr. Dunnigan, an Examiner writer, this pencil being of the same quality as the one used in the business office. Mr. Dunnigan told me that the Examiner office supplied its employees with this style of pencil. A microscopic examination proved my claim correct. Please note enclosed photograph marked with red pencil, showing same quality of graphite containing very low percentage of clay. The other part of the ad, including the erasures, is written with a medium soft pencil. On March 23rd, Captain Seymour sent a police officer to me with instructions that the Examiner ad must be instantly returned to the Examiner office, as they insisted on having the original immediately. A few days afterward, wishing to show the captain the existence of two kinds of pencils used in the body of the original Examiner ad, I called by order of the captain on Mr. Roberts for same, was refused, and because I had no written order from the captain. A few days subsequently, I again went to Mr. Roberts with a written order from Captain Seymour and was again refused. If you so desire, I shall in a few days give you my reasons for my opinion by the aid of many microphotographs. I hereby report again that after a careful examination of many specimens of C.B. Hadley's writing, both in ink and pencil, I find that the C.B. Hawkins and Umson's books, the Chronicle ink advertisement, and the Examiner pencil advertisement are in the handwriting of C.B. Hadley. Respectfully, T. Keitka, handwriting expert. April 25th. Armed with this information, police are hot to trot to get Hadley in their grasp. Keitka, the handwriting guy, is continuing his work, noting that the initials of CBH as written on the purchased mattress and the initials that Hadley would write were exactly similar. Police are not putting all of their eggs in this basket, but it's enough for them to redouble their efforts in finding Hadley for questioning. April 28th. Hadley's gal pal, Ollie, who also went by the name Carrie Dixon, would be questioned further about Hadley in the days leading up to when Nora would have disappeared. She would say that Hadley did not sleep in his home the night of or the day which Nora left her own home to meet Bennett. Within a week of when Hadley himself disappeared, Ollie would say that his hair showed signs of turning white, showed great mental duress, and would have to sleep sometimes with the help of narcotics. Apparently, the whole thing of him having financial issues at the Examiner are being poo-pooed by the Examiner itself, a cashier claiming that Hadley had not defaulted on any costs and that if Hadley had returned to work, he would have his job back. Ollie would state before Hadley was ever even linked to Nora, quote, "I am sure that something terrible has caused Hadley to drop from sight. He has been acting like a crazy man for the past week. I noticed that his hair was turning white, and when I wanted to know the cause, he would say that I was the cause. He could not sleep at night and took some white powders, a thing that I had never known him to do before in the year that we were together. A few days before he dropped from sight, he took his parents' pictures from a frame and tore them up. He did not sleep at home last Saturday night. He came home in the afternoon, and just before dinner time, 6 o'clock, he rushed out of the house and did not even stop to lace up his shoes. He came home about 7 on Sunday morning, and we did not go out on Sunday, though that was our usual habit. That was the first Sunday that Hadley had not taken me out." End quote. Some believe that Hadley had gone to Mexico because it's a place he had went to before and stayed for some time. May 8th. Hadley had been formally accused of Nora's murder. Nora's mom would go to the Hall of Justice and swear to a complaint charging Hadley with the murder, and the judge would issue a warrant for Hadley's arrest. 1913. Wait, what? Yeah, Nora's death at this point, and even until now, never solved. Charles Hadley was never found. We don't know if Hadley is Bennett, is Hawkins in any official capacity, but needless to say, nothing came of any of these leads. Had Nora died today, there would be DNA testing out the wazoo, checking under her fingernails, looking for strands of hair other than her own among her meager possessions in that murder house. Fingerprints on any surface, including doorknobs, taken and compared. But without that technology back in these days and the lack of what we now call our surveillance state, where every move we make would be documented by camera somewhere, we have no clue how Nora came to be in that house. If Hadley really did go to Mexico for the rest of his life, or did he take his own life, as some would assume? We don't know, and it's highly doubtful we will ever know. But her story deserves to be told. And that's why we're here today. If you like this story, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next week.